8 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, Human Rights Watch says Canada is still falling short.
When people think of Canada, most people think of it as a fair and safe place to live. But for Indigenous Canadians, the reality is the complete opposite. They are 9 times more likely to end up in jail, and 50% of Indigenous households have trouble reading. They earn almost half of what non-Indigenous Canadians earn on average and struggle with alcoholism, drug abuse, and health problems at a far above the average rate. The question is, why? It's no secret that being Indigenous and First Nations in Canada is economically and socially challenging. Indigenous peoples in Canada have much higher rates of poverty, illiteracy, teenage pregnancy, crime, and mental illness than non-Indigenous citizens. Canada's troubling colonial past, residential schools, and cultural genocide all play a part in today's current economic and social reality for Indigenous people, but it goes further than that. In this video, we're taking a look at the economic challenges that persist for Indigenous people and the causes behind the stagnation and misery that grips so many reserves. We will also take a closer look at what changes can be made to help Indigenous people and improve their overall situation in Canada. First, let's define what it means to be a First Nations or Indigenous Canadian. In Canada, an Indigenous person is defined by the Government of Canada as a collective name for the original peoples of North America and their descendants. Sometimes the term Aboriginal peoples is also used. The Canadian Constitution recognizes 3 groups of Indigenous peoples: Indians, more commonly referred to as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Canada's Indigenous population currently numbers over 1.8 million as of the most recent census and makes up more than 630 First Nations communities across Canada and over 50 languages. In contrast to non-Indigenous Canadians, the Indigenous population in Canada is younger, expanding more rapidly, and tends to reside in rural regions. From 2011 to 2016, the Indigenous population increased by 18.9%, and from 2016 to 2021 by 9.4%. These growth rates surpass those of the non-Indigenous population, which grew by over 4% and 5% during the same periods. This accelerated growth is partly due to increased rates of self-identification and higher fertility rates among Indigenous peoples. Indigenous communities in Canada face many interconnected challenges that contribute to poorer health outcomes, lower levels of education, inadequate housing and crowded living conditions, lower income levels, higher rates of unemployment, higher levels of incarceration, increased rates of unintentional injuries and early deaths among children and youth, and higher rates of suicide. The illiteracy rate among Indigenous Canadians is extremely high. In the past decade, 50% of Indigenous households were classed as having serious literacy problems. The violent crime rate for Indigenous people is around 9 times higher than for non-Indigenous people in Canada, with Indigenous Canadians comprising around 25% of prisoners provincially and federally. That is despite comprising only around 5% of the total population. Alcoholism and drug abuse continue to plague Indigenous communities across Canada, and 26 Indigenous reserves still have no drinkable water, despite Justin Trudeau's promises during his 2015 election run. These problems are deeply rooted in historical and ongoing colonial legacy, as well as generations of being marginalized, starting with colonization and the reservation system. The Canadian reservation system was first established in the 1630s in colonial Quebec by the Catholic Church to settle previously semi-nomadic Indigenous peoples and convert them to Catholicism, and were later expanded to include areas where tribes were granted their own lands. In English Canada, the British were focused on the fur trade and setting up reserve lands and status under the Crown in several Crown proclamations in the 1760s in order to negotiate for furs. In Atlantic Canada, reserves were established despite the proclamation, often through non-treaty means. Newfoundland recognized Mi'kmaq rights in 1987. In Quebec, officials often disregarded proclamation requirements, settling reserve claims as needed. Modern treaty negotiations like the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975 ushered in a new era of Indigenous governance. Ontario's sticking to the proclamation faltered with rapid settlement eroding Indigenous title, leading to agreements and acts diminishing their rights. British Columbia's aggressive expansion resulted in complex land claim negotiations, while the prairies witnessed treaty negotiations negotiations overshadowed by assimilation and segregation policies. Territories have few reserves, with the Métis or Inuit settlements prevailing. The Indian Act of 1876 regulated Indian status and reserves, often fraught with discriminatory policies and unresolved land claim disputes. Reserves are governed by the Indian Act and are owned by the Crown and given to specific Indigenous bands to those with registered status. Reserve residents are typically members of the band they reside in, with registered Indian status automatically conferring membership. Non-registered individuals may join a band with council approval. Notably, the number of registered Indians living off-reserve has continued to grow, with more than half residing off-reserve by 2011. In terms of economic opportunity and problems, Indigenous Canadians have much less economic opportunity than non-Indigenous Canadians. Indigenous people have higher unemployment rates and lower wages than non-Indigenous people. The median per capita income for an Indigenous Canadian living on the reserve is the median on-reserve income $26,800, which is approximately 66% of the median income for the overall population of $40,800. According to the most recent figures, Indigenous GDP was around $48.9 billion in 2020, comprising just around 2% of Canadian GDP in total. Reserves, historically situated on less valuable land far from major population centers, often lacks access to natural resources. Nearly 70% of reserves are over 50 kilometers away from service centers. Economic development in First Nations communities is hindered by property rights restrictions imposed by the Indian Act, which increase transaction costs and hinder access to capital. While bands have exclusive use rights over reserve lands, legal title remains with the Crown, necessitating approval from both the band council and the federal government for any land transactions. Additionally, reserve land cannot be seized, mortgaged, or pledged to non-band members, limiting collateral for business loans and hindering firm creation and employment opportunities on reserves. The lack of local businesses results in a significant portion of earnings leaving the community as households consume goods and services elsewhere. Property rights limitations under the Indian Act discussed in Section 3 restrict access to affordable secured loans, leading to higher debt service costs for First Nations businesses and hindering homeownership for many reserve households. Additionally, poor socioeconomic conditions in First Nations and Inuit communities can impair creditworthiness and complicate access to funding. Challenges such as inadequate infrastructure, limited banking services in remote areas, and low financial literacy further reduce financial capacity. Moreover, Indigenous individuals have reported feeling unwelcomed in mainstream financial institutions, as indicated by a survey on fringe financial institutions. These barriers to financial inclusion perpetuate chronic underinvestment in Indigenous communities and exacerbate socioeconomic challenges, creating a negative feedback loop. 8 years ago, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada issued 94 calls to action to address the historical injustices of residential schools, aiming to redress the harm inflicted upon Indigenous communities where thousands of children died. The review encompassed 31 studies retrieved from 7 databases, highlighting that Indigenous workers encounter numerous additional challenges, including worse health outcomes and workplace discrimination impacting their mental well-being. Additionally, they often face cumulative exposures to occupational and environmental hazards from nearby industries such as asbestos. Limited access to education and training further exacerbates employment challenges for Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous workers are employed in the goods-producing sector, particularly in mining, which presents both job opportunities and challenges, including land dispossession and environmental pollution. Employment has been found to have a protective effect against substance use in Indigenous communities, although socioeconomic factors like lower status in youth increase the risk of cannabis use. Unemployment is associated with a higher likelihood of gambling problems among Indigenous individuals, although this may be linked to poverty or educational factors rather than unemployment itself. Indigenous populations in Canada experience higher rates of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes compared to the general population. Employment patterns among Indigenous individuals with diabetes suggest longer working years, possibly due to psychosocial factors or inadequate financial support. Addressing socioeconomic disparities, including employment opportunities, is crucial for reducing the burden of chronic diseases among Métis populations. Unemployment among Indigenous peoples is linked to decreased psychological well-being, highlighting the need for policies addressing their basic psychological needs. Indigenous workers also face higher rates of workplace racism and discrimination, impacting their overall work experience. Differences in work-related values and career choices exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, perpetuating stereotypes and structural inequalities. Indigenous people in British Columbia have a higher incidence of injuries, including work-related injuries, compared to the general population. The disparities in injury rates may stem from various factors such as employment rates, types of occupations, and industries. While there has been a decline in workers' compensation injury rates overall, this decline is less substantial for Indigenous workers, particularly those in urban areas who may face higher risks due to employment factors. Lower high school completion rates among Indigenous individuals, particularly those on reserves, also contributes to higher unemployment rates and subsequent health impacts. WorkSafe BC data reveals that Indigenous individuals experience higher injury rates even after adjusting for factors like age, gender, and location, indicating the compounding effects of various health determinants. Additionally, occupational and environmental health issues intersect for Indigenous workers, with exposures extending beyond the workplace due to industrial pollution. Indigenous workers are more likely to be self-employed, resulting in fewer protections from workers' compensation as well. However, increasing access to distance learning opportunities could lead to higher skilled, higher paying jobs and reduce exposure to workplace hazards. Concerns also arise regarding the exclusion of Indigenous individuals with conditions like type 2 diabetes from safety-sensitive positions due to health risks. Psychosocial hazards faced by Indigenous workers include racism, discrimination, and work-life balance conflicts related to land dispossession and environmental pollution. Addressing these issues requires cultural sensitivity and empowerment strategies rather than solely relying on generic training modules. Despite some research on psychosocial hazards, there's a lack of data on occupational diseases and injuries among Indigenous workers. Further research and data collection, particularly regarding occupational exposures in Indigenous communities, are needed to address these disparities and understand the specific risks faced by Indigenous workers. For instance, recent data highlights high rates of asbestos exposure in the territories where Indigenous populations are prominent, indicating the need for targeted interventions and adjustments in occupational health policies. This brings us to a crucial question: what can be done to improve the economic and social situation of Indigenous people in Canada? As the fastest-growing population in Canada and its original residents, the well-being of Indigenous people is crucial for Canada. There are numerous measures that can be taken to improve Aboriginal economic opportunities. The Government of Canada should explore various financing options like establishing an Indigenous housing fund or providing long-term loan guarantees to support home mortgages. Increase collaboration between the Government of Canada and Indigenous organizations like the First Nations Finance Authority to pilot projects aimed at replacing diesel generation in remote communities. The government should create a navigator position in consultation with Indigenous economic organizations to assist Indigenous entrepreneurs in accessing relevant business programs. The government should address administrative burdens in economic development programs for Indigenous peoples to ensure they don't miss opportunities due to delays. Exploring options to improve access to capital for Indigenous communities, including establishing equity funds and mirroring successful funding models. Refining the requirement for awarding federal contracts to Indigenous businesses, ensuring transparency and equitable opportunities. Creating a registry of Indigenous businesses to facilitate better communication and procurement with federal departments. Supporting Indigenous literacy initiatives and exploring the establishment of a national Indigenous education institution. The Government of Canada should align infrastructure funding with the specific needs of northern and remote Indigenous communities, recognizing the vital role of critical infrastructure in fostering economic development opportunities. Additionally, there should be more meaningful engagement with Indigenous businesses and communities in major infrastructure projects in the north. The Indigenous economy shows growth potential, with Indigenous workers poised to play a significant role in Canada's labor market expansion. Despite some improvements in Indigenous economic outcomes over recent decades, notable disparities persist compared to the non-Indigenous population, primarily due to institutional barriers, infrastructure gaps, and financial limitations. The future of Canada hinges on enhancing Indigenous capacity to participate in the economy. Engagement is essential for achieving sustainable development, combating climate change, facilitating international trade, addressing labor shortages, enhancing economic productivity, and ensuring access to basic services in remote and rural areas across the country. Additionally, our involvement is crucial for upholding Canada's Canada's reputation in global human rights issues. If you like this video and want to learn more about what's really going on in Canada, check out this video here. And if this video brought value to you today, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video. Thanks for watching.